The screwdriver felt heavy in Jimmy Turner's hand, not from its weight but from the rhythm of the morning. It was 8:47 a.m., and the Ohio sun was already climbing, casting slanted beams through the tall windows of the Victorian house on Grafton Avenue. Jimmy knelt by the baseboard, his toolkit open beside him, a faint hum of electricity in the air. The chandelier above had been flickering for weeks, the owner said, a stubborn short that 3 other electricians couldn't pin down. Jimmy wasn't surprised. Old houses like this, with their century-old wiring and layers of quick fixes, were puzzles he'd learned to solve by feel as much as by training. He tightened the last screw on the junction box, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, and stood to test the switch. The chandelier flared to life, its crystal prisms scattering light across the sunroom's hardwood floor. A soft clink of glass accompanied the steady glow. No flicker, no stutter. He nodded to himself, satisfied, and began packing his tools. "You're good at this, you know that." The voice came from the doorway, clear and direct, like a bell cutting through fog. Jimmy froze mid-motion, the flathead still in his grip. He turned, squinting against the morning light, and saw Helena Harper, leaning against the doorframe, arms loosely crossed. She was 33, barefoot, wearing a loose white blouse tucked into faded jeans. Her dark hair pulled into a messy bun with strands falling around her face. Her eyes, sharp and brown, held his without flinching. Jimmy blinked, caught off guard. Thanks," he said, his voice low, caught somewhere between surprise and caution. Clients complimented him before. "Quick, nice job," or "You're a lifesaver," tossed out as they signed the invoice. But this was different. Elena's tone wasn't polite or patronizing. It was plain, like she was stating the sky was blue. And that threw him more than the words themselves. He wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his tool belt and stepped back from the switch. It was a loose neutral in the junction box, he explained, keeping his tone professional. "Old wiring, probably original to the house. I replaced the connector and added a surge protector. Should be steady now." Elena nodded, but she didn't move from the doorway. "That's good," she said, her voice even a beat past. "You always explain it like that, clear, like you're teaching someone who's never seen a wire before." Jimmy shrugged, coiling the old wiring into a plastic bag. Clarity matters when it's someone's home. He didn't look up, focusing on the task, but he felt her eyes on him, steady and unhurried. "That's true," she said, and he caught the faintest smile in her voice. "Most people don't bother." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, but it carried weight, like the air before a spring rain. Jimmy zipped his toolkit, glancing at her briefly. She was still there, barefoot on the polished floor, her posture relaxed but her gaze attentive, like she was reading something in him he hadn't meant to show. He cleared his throat. "Anything else you need fixed while I'm here?" Elena tilted her head, considering. "Not today," she said, but she paused, then stepped into the room, her feet silent against the wood. "Do you have time for lunch? There's a diner 2 blocks over, Rusty's. They make a mean fried chicken sandwich. My treat." Jimmy's hands stilled on the toolkit. "Lunch." The word landed like a wrench dropped in an empty hallway, loud and unexpected. His first instinct was to say no. He'd been raised on boundaries: never mix personal with professional, never blur the lines, especially not with a client who lived in a house like this, with its wraparound porch, stained glass windows, and a driveway that could fit his entire apartment building. But Elena stood there, not pushing, not flirting, just waiting, her offer as straightforward as her compliment. "I appreciate it," he said, meeting her eyes, "but I've got another job in an hour." It was half true. His next call wasn't urgent, just a routine outlet replacement in West Dayton, but the excuse felt safer than stepping into whatever this was. Elena studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Another time, then," she said, extending a hand. "Thanks for the fix, Jimmy." He shook it, surprised by the firmness of her grip, warm and steady. Not the delicate handshake he'd expected from someone who lived in a place like this. "No problem, Miss Harper." "Elena," she corrected, her smile small but genuine. He nodded, slinging his toolkit over his shoulder, as he walked out of the sunroom, down the wide staircase, and through the foyer with its polished banister. He felt her watching him, not predatory, not even curious, just present, like she was seeing him for the first time. The weight of it stayed with him as he stepped into the April sunlight. Jimmy's truck coughed to life, the AC rattling against the growing heat. He pulled away from the Victorian, the name Harper, still echoing in his mind like a brand. As he merged onto Stewart Street, he glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing on the porch. She wasn't. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the moment. By the time he parked outside a squat ranch house with a cracked mailbox and a sagging front step, he'd mostly pushed it aside. Mostly his phone buzzed as he logged the job in his work app. A new message, from a number not in his contacts. The preview read, "Alina, in case you change your mind about lunch." He stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen, then slid the phone into his pocket without replying. Jimmy Turner wasn't a man who chased daydreams. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner and still found time to teach him how to strip wire at age 9. He believed in what was real, showing up early, checking the voltage twice, doing the job right. His hands were steady, his focus sharp, and his heart stayed out of the way. But Elena's voice, those 5 words, delivered with no agenda, had cracked something in him. Not a break, just a hairline fracture in the armor he wore every day. That night, in his 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on 3rd Street, the hum of Dayton's traffic muffled by thin windows. He opened the message again. Alina, just her name, just a handful of words. He typed a reply, deleted it, tried again, then sighed and powered off the phone. Maybe it was just lunch. Maybe it was something else. But Jimmy had survived 30 years by knowing the difference between kindness and complication, and he wasn't ready to blur that line. 3 days passed, and Jimmy didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. Every time he saw her name on his screen, his thumb hesitated, caught between curiosity and caution. What could he say? That he was flattered, that he hadn't stopped thinking about her bare feet on the hardwood, her voice cutting through the quiet like a wire through insulation. That he was a guy with calloused hands and a beat-up truck who had no business stepping into a world where people owned art, not just hung it. It was Friday afternoon when the second message came. Fried chicken sandwich still on the menu. Tomorrow, noon, I'll drive. No question mark, no hesitation, just an invitation, as bold as her first words. Jimmy was in the supply aisle at Bailey's Hardware, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air thick with the scent of cut lumber and machine oil. He stared at the text, the weight of it grounding him in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. Before he could overthink it, he typed, "Okay, drop a pin." He hit send and shoved the phone back in his pocket, his pulse ticking up like a meter reading. Saturday arrived too fast. Jimmy stood outside Bailey's, the hardware store's faded sign creaking in the breeze. He'd swapped his work boots for clean sneakers, his usual navy polo for a crisp gray button-up, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Not dressy, not casual, just presentable. The spring sun was high, but the air carried a mild edge, the kind that made you notice the world was still waking up. He rubbed his palms together, chasing away the nervous sweat, and waited. At 12:02, a sleek silver Mazda CX-5 pulled into the lot, its engine purring softly. Alina stepped out, barefoot again, in a flowy green dress that caught the light like water. Her hair was pinned up, loose tendrils framing her face. She smiled, not wide, but real. "You always this punctual?" she asked, leaning against the car. "Habit," Jimmy said, straightening. "You always barefoot?" "Only when I'm keeping it real," she said, her laugh light but unguarded. "Hop in." They drove out of Dayton, past brick storefronts and aging bungalows toward the rolling hills beyond the city. The radio stayed off, the only sound, the soft rush of wind through a cracked window. They passed a cluster of old churches, their steeples worn but proud, a faded barn with a quilt pattern painted on its side, and a lone school bus parked in an empty lot. "I know a spot," Alina said, her voice soft, not fancy, but peaceful. 20 minutes later, they pulled onto a gravel road that opened into a clearing by the Great Miami River. Tall pines framed the space, their shadows stretching across the grass. A narrow river glinted just beyond the tree line, its surface dancing with sunlight. A weathered picnic table sat under an old oak, its bark rough but steady. No one else was around. Jimmy stepped out first, scanning the clearing like he was checking a circuit panel, cautious, observant, always measuring. Alina grabbed a brown paper bag from the back seat and walked ahead, her bare toes brushing the grass. They sat at the table, the wood creaking under their weight. For a long time, neither spoke. They unwrapped their sandwiches, fried chicken, coleslaw, pickles, a smear of spicy mayo on toasted brioche. She was right. Rusty's didn't mess around. The crunch of the bread, the temps of the sauce, filled the silence better than words could. Finally, Alina spoke. Do you think I'm weird? She didn't look at him, her eyes on the river dot. Jimmy paused, a pickle halfway to his mouth. What I mean, I just asked a stranger to lunch, drove him to the middle of nowhere, barefoot. She glanced at him, her smile teasing but curious. He chewed, considering. You're not weird, you're unexpected. She tilted her head. Is that a compliment? It is, if you've spent most of your life being overlooked, he said, surprising himself with the honesty that quieted her for a moment. Then, softly, I don't overlook people. I noticed, he said, meeting her eyes. The silence that followed was different, lighter, like a wire stripped clean. Alina set her sandwich down, dusted her fingers. I used to come here as a kid, she said. My grandma brought me. She said the river could carry away whatever you didn't need to hold on to. Jimmy nodded, watching the water slip over smooth stones. Smart woman, she was. Raised me more than my parents did. Alina leaned back on her hands, face tilted to the sky, eyes closed. You know what I like about you? He raised a brow. I'm cheap labor. She laughed, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. No, you don't ask about my house, my car, what I do. You're not impressed. I was taught not to stare at what doesn't belong to me, he said, his voice steady but soft. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto his. And what if it does? Jimmy didn't answer, not because he didn't have a thought, but because her question wasn't about ownership. It was about worth. The light shifted, the air cooled, a breeze rustling the oak above them. I should go, he said quietly, brushing crumbs from his jeans. Alina didn't move. Will you? He stood, slow and deliberate. Not if you ask me to stay. Her smile was small, certain. Then stay. So he did. They sat under that oak until the shadows stretched long and the air turned crisp. They talked about nothing. Heavy favorite snacks. His, salt and vinegar chips. Hers, peach, rings. Worst customers. His, a guy who insisted his toaster was haunted. Hers, a client who wanted a logo in Comic Sans. Childhood scars. His, a gash from falling off a bike. Hers, a burn from a campfire. It wasn't romantic, wasn't scripted, it was honest. And for a man who'd spent his life behind schedules and tools, it felt like a door cracking open. That night, Jimmy didn't go straight home. He drove past the diner where his mom used to work, its neon sign flickering like a bad bulb. Past the corner where he'd scrapped with a kid over a stolen Walkman at 14. Past the high school where no one cared enough to learn his name. When he finally pulled into the lot behind his apartment, his phone buzzed. Alina, next time, you bring the sandwiches. He smiled, just a little, and for the first time in years, Jimmy Turner let himself hope. The week crawled by, heavy with work, outlet replacements in Oakwood, a breaker reset in Huber Heights, a full day rewiring, a duplex, in 5 Points. But Elena's voice echoed in his head, her words from the park replaying like a looped track. And what if it does? He didn't know what to do with that, but he couldn't shake it either. Not the words, but how she'd said them, calm, challenging, like she saw through the shell he'd built. Wednesday afternoon, knee-deep in a faulty junction box in a downtown apartment, his phone buzzed. He wiped sweat from his forehead and checked it. Alina, you free Friday night? His reply came faster than he expected. What's the plan? Her response, my place. Nothing fancy, just dinner. He typed back, should I bring tools or wine? Her reply was quick, just yourself, and maybe ditch the boots. Friday arrived with a knot in Jimmy's stomach. He stood outside Elena's front door, the same sleek wood and brushed nickel handle from a week ago. This time, he wasn't here to fix anything. He'd swapped his work shirt for a navy sweater, his boots for loafers. He carried a brown paper bag with store-bought cornbread, still warm from the oven he'd borrowed from his neighbor. He rang the bell. The door opened slowly, and there was Alina barefoot, in a soft gray cardigan and black leggings, her hair loosely pinned, no makeup, no polish, just her. Hey, she said, her smile warm. Evening, Jimmy replied, holding up the bag, brought cornbread. Not homemade, but I tried. That's the most Ohio thing I've heard all week, she said, stepping aside. Come in. The house smelled of roasted garlic and thyme, a warmth that felt like home. Not wealth, Jimmy followed her to the kitchen, where 2 plates were set on the island, candles flickering softly. A low R&B playlist hummed in the background. "Hope you like pork chops," Alina said, setting down a tray of glazed chops and roasted vegetables. "I like food I don't have to cook," Jimmy said, settling onto a stool. So yeah, they ate slowly, the conversation flowing like the river at the park. Alina talked about a client who'd rejected her logo design for being too bold. Jimmy shared a story about getting stuck in a crawlspace during a heat wave. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her water, her hand brushing his as she steadied herself. At one point, she leaned her elbow on the counter, chin in her palm. "You have a quiet way of being loud," she said. Jimmy raised a brow. "That, a compliment, it is. You don't force your presence, you just have it." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, but something in his chest stirred, warm and unfamiliar. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Alina curled into the corner of an oversized couch. Jimmy sat at the other end, unsure of the rules. She looked over. "You don't need to be so polite. Wasn't raised to slouch in a woman's house," he said, half smiling. She rolled her eyes. "You're allowed to be comfortable, Jimmy, especially here." The air shifted, not heavy but charged, like the moment before a circuit connects. Alina broke it gently. "You ever wonder what people say about us?" "Us," Jimmy echoed. "You mean you and me?" She gestured vaguely around the room. "This, whatever this is." He exhaled slowly. "Probably a lot. Probably none of it good." Alina nodded, looking toward the window. "My world's loud, not just noise, but expectations, appearances. You don't walk through it unnoticed." "I don't aim to," Jimmy said. "But I also don't ask for permission." Her eyes met his again. "That's what scares them." He held her gaze. "What about you?" "I don't scare easy," she said, her voice soft but sure. Later, as she walked him to the door, there was no kiss, no lingering touch, just a quiet moment under the porch light. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Thanks for the food," he replied. As he stepped down the stairs, she called after him, "You still owe me sandwiches." He glanced back, grinning. "Next time, I'll even toast 'em." The next morning, Jimmy sat at Rusty's diner, a corner booth by the window. The regulars nodded as he walked in, the smell of coffee and bacon grease thick in the air. He ordered black coffee and grits, opened his phone, and saw a new message from Elena, blurry photo of a sandwich drawn in crayon, childish and absurd. The caption read, "Visual inspiration. Get it right." He laughed into his coffee, but the moment was cut short by a voice behind him. "Isn't that the guy with the rich girl on Instagram?" A man's voice, too loud, from the next booth. Another voice chuckled. "Yeah, her little project." Jimmy stiffened, his grip tightening on the mug. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but the words landed like a spark on dry wood. He slid his phone into his pocket and stared out the window, the warmth of the night before cooling under the weight of reality. Monday morning hit like a breaker, tripping sudden, loud, relentless. Jimmy Turner was up before dawn, his boots laced by 5:30 a.m. The air in his apartment sharp with the smell of instant coffee. Dayton streets were still dark as he drove to his first job, a shorted kitchen panel in a duplex off Patterson Road. The work was steady. Familiar: strip the wire, test the voltage, secure the connection. Each task was a tether to the real, a way to keep the whispers from the diner at bay. Her little project. The words clung to him like damp sawdust, gritty and hard to shake. By noon, he was at a small ranch house in Kettering, replacing a busted breaker. His phone stayed silent in his back pocket, but his mind wasn't. Elena's crayon-drawn sandwich, her laugh under the oak tree. The way her eyes didn't waver when she'd said, "I don't scare easy," they looped through his thoughts, pulling against the weight of those overheard words. He didn't text her back. Not yet. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure what came next. A guy like him, calloused hands, a truck that rattled more than it rolled, didn't belong in a world of Victorian houses and barefoot women who spoke like they owned the air. Tuesday brought more work. A humming transformer in an old Baptist church on Gettysburg Avenue, then a flickering porch light in Belmont. Jimmy buried himself in it, letting the rhythm of wire cutters and multimeters drown out everything else. But at the church, as he knelt in the dusty crawlspace, his uncle, Marvin, who ran Turner Electric, pulled him aside. Marvin was a broad man, gray at the temples, with a voice like gravel. "Jimmy," he said, arms folded, "you got any idea why the Clarkson account just canceled?" Jimmy frowned, wiping grease from his fingers. No, sir. I haven't touched their property in a month. Yeah, well, Marvin said, scratching his jaw. They mentioned something about public image, said they saw you online. You doing something I need to know about. The question wasn't harsh, but it cut. Jimmy's jaw tightened. I haven't done anything but my job. Marvin nodded, his eyes steady but searching. All right, let's keep it that way. Jimmy didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking under his weight, his phone glowing in his hand. Elena's name was still there, her last message unanswered. He could tell her about the diner, the cancelled job, the way the world seemed to draw lines around him without asking, but he didn't. Instead, he scrolled through his work app, checking tomorrow's schedule, as if more jobs could patch the crack widening in his chest. Wednesday evening, his phone rang. Elena's name lit up the screen, and he answered before he could talk himself out of it. You free? She asked, her voice low, warm, like a fire on a cold night. Define free, he said, leaning against his truck in the hardware store lot. I'm in my driveway with 2 milkshakes and no one to share them with. He smiled despite himself. You bought 2 on purpose, didn't you? No comment. Come over. Be there in 15. When Jimmy pulled into Elena's driveway, the Victorian loomed under the dusk, its windows glowing gold. She sat on the front steps, legs tucked under her, sipping a paper cup with whipped cream spilling over the lid. She handed him the other chocolate peanut butter, thick and cold. Figured you for a classic, she said. He took it, sitting beside her. You were right. They drank in silence, the wind whistling through the maples, lining her yard. Crickets hummed, and the air carried the faint sweetness of blooming lilacs. But Elena shifted, her shoulder brushing his. I need to ask you something, she said, not looking at him. Jimmy nodded, his pulse ticking up. Okay, did someone say something to you? Her voice was steady, but her eyes, when they met his, were searching. He hesitated, staring at the milkshake in his hands. Heard something at Rusty's. Some guy called me your project. Elena exhaled, long and slow, like she'd been holding her breath for days. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for what people say, he said, his tone firmer than he meant. I do when they say it because of me. She set her cup down, her fingers brushing the stone step. People talk, they always have, about my family, my work, who I choose to spend time with. It's noise, Jimmy, but it's loud. He turned toward her. It's not your fault I don't fit their world. You fit mine, she said, her voice sharp with conviction. And that's the only one I care about. A beat passed, then another. Jimmy's throat tightened. Lost a client, he admitted. Clarkson's they pulled out after some post about us went up. A picture from the park. Elena stiffened, her eyes narrowing. What post? Someone snapped us at the river. Guess it made the rounds. He shrugged, trying to keep it light, but the weight was there, heavy as a bad circuit. Damn it, she whispered, standing and pacing a few steps. I'm so sick of this. Sick of people thinking they get to decide who I can be with, who you get to be. Jimmy stood slowly, his hands in his pockets. Maybe we take a break. Her head snapped toward him. What, not from each other, he said quickly. From the noise, the eyes, the phones, the assumptions. She stared at him, her eyes not pleading but raw, like a canvas before the first stroke. You think that'll help? I think if I don't take a breath, I'll suffocate, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena nodded, her jaw tight. Okay, if that's what you need. It's not forever, he said, stepping closer. I know. She placed her palm on his chest, her touch light but grounding. You're not a project, Jimmy Turner. You're not small. You're not temporary. He looked at her, his eyes stinging. Then why does it feel like I'm always fighting to prove that? She didn't answer with words, just leaned in, her forehead resting against his. They stood like that, 2 people caught between care and caution, the porch light casting long shadows across the lawn. When Jimmy drove away, the light stayed on longer than it needed to, and he felt it in his rearview mirror, a quiet pull he couldn't ignore. Rain fell steady that Thursday, coating Dayton's streets in a silver sheen. Jimmy sat in his truck outside his apartment, wipers off, engine quiet, watching droplets race down the windshield. It had been a week since the milkshake on Elena's porch. 5 days since he'd asked for space. 4 nights of restless sleep, 3 missed calls from her, and 1 growing knot of regret. The silence hadn't brought peace, only clarity. He missed her, not just the meals or the laughter, but the way she said his name like it carried weight, the way she saw past his work boots and into the man underneath. He reached for his phone, not to call or text, but to drive. Elena's house looked the same: wide porch, warm lights, wind chimes swaying under the eaves. But it felt quieter, no music spilling from the windows, no shadow moving behind the curtains. He almost didn't knock, but his fist found the door. She opened it after a moment, standing there in an oversized hoodie, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a smudge of blue paint on her wrist. Her face held no surprise, just something softer, worn, like a page read too many times. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She raised an eyebrow. "You just in the area?" He smiled, sheepish. "Okay, I lied. I wasn't." She stepped aside. "You coming in, or you measuring the humidity?" Inside, the air smelled of acrylic paint and fresh coffee. Canvases leaned against the walls, one half finished on an easy storm in blues and grays, like a city sinking into the sea. Jimmy nodded. "Toward it yours." "Therapy," she said, her voice dry but honest. "You ever planned to show these?" He stepped closer, studying the chaotic strokes, the rawness of it. "They're not for anyone but me," she said, sitting on the floor by the window, hugging her knees. "When I was 14, a teacher told me I had talent, then said not to waste it on urban angst." Her words, not mine. Jimmy sat across from her, his back against the wall. "Had a guidance counselor tell me to stick to electrician work 'cause college might frustrate me." They laughed, but it was hollow, the kind of laugh that knows the world's edges too well. "I didn't come to dig up old wounds," Jimmy said quietly. "Then, why'd you come?" Elena's voice was soft, not accusing. He hesitated, his hands resting on his knees. "Because I don't want to be the guy who walks away when things get hard. And because I realize this thing with oozes and noise, it's real, and it's terrifying." A pause. Then she whispered, "Same." They sat in the dim light, the rain tapping the windows like a metronome. Finally, Elena stood, crossed to a bookshelf, and pulled out a slim folder. She handed it to him. Inside were printout screenshots of social media posts, blog comments, grainy photos of them at the park, another of Jimmy outside her house. The words were sharp, mocking, invasive. Elena Harper's new toy, the electrician's big break, charity case or social stunt. "I didn't want to show you earlier," she said, her voice low. "You were carrying enough." Jimmy flipped through the pages, his jaw tight. "How long's this been going on?" "Since the park. Someone at that picnic recognized you. It spiraled from there." "They know where you live," he said, his voice flat. She nodded. "I upgraded the cameras, got a security company on call. You should have told me, didn't want to scare you off." She gave him a look, half smile, half challenge. "You asked for space, Jimmy. I thought you were gone." He closed the folder, exhaling hard. "I thought space would protect us, but it just showed me there's no safe distance from this, from them." "No," Elena agreed, sitting beside him, their knees brushing, but there's strength in being close. He met her eyes, steady now. "I'm here, and I'm not hiding. I can't promise it'll get easier," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't want easier," he said. "I want truth." She reached out, her fingers intertwining with his. "Then, let's start now." That night, they sat on her couch, the storm outside, a low hum, no music, no wine, just silence, shared like a promise. Elena rested her head on his shoulder. "I've been called a lot of things," she said. "Too bold, too cold, too much." Jimmy kissed her temple, his lips brushing her skin. They missed the best one. "What's that?" "Mine." She smiled, soft and certain, and in that small room, lit by street lamps and their quiet honesty, the line between fear and courage blurred. 2 months passed, not in a rush but in a steady unfolding, like a blueprint coming to life. Sunday mornings became their ritual. Jimmy would bring breakfast biscuits and sausage gravy from Rusty's, still warm in their foam containers, and Elena would brew coffee in a French press she swore made it taste alive. They'd sit by the window in her studio, a converted room at the back of the house, knees touching, sunlight spilling over their legs like a lazy river. The noise hadn't stopped. Online whispers, sidelong glances at jobs, but Jimmy had stopped listening. They were building something, and it was theirs. One Sunday, as crumbs littered the table and coffee steamed in their mugs, Elena turned to him. "I have an idea." Jimmy grinned. "That usually ends with paint or trouble." This time, it's both. She handed him a tablet, the screen glowing with a mock-up of a website. Turner Works, a logo, a simple bolt, crossed with a paintbrush sat above a tagline, built with hands, driven by heart. The design was clean, bold, with pages for services, testimonials, and a gallery of Elena's design work alongside Jimmy's electrical projects. He blinked, stunned. Is this real? I've been working on it in my spare time, she said. Branding, copy, visuals. You said you wanted to go independent, so I made a blueprint. You did all this. He scrolled through, noting the fonts, the colors, the way it felt like them. Every pixel, every word. You're an Ohio boy, so I went with a nod to Gotham font. Trust me. He was quiet for a long moment. Why? She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. Because when I see something good, I don't wait for someone else to validate it. I invest. You don't think it's too soon? He asked, not out of doubt but raw honesty. Too soon for what? Your dream. Your name on your work. His chest tightened, not painfully, but full. What do you want from me? I want to build something with you, she said, her eyes locked on his. Not for you, not around you, with you. By the end of the week, Jimmy had filed for a business license. Elena helped him design flyers, and they printed them at a local shop. The machines hummed, filling the air as they laughed over a typo in the first batch. On Saturday, they walked through Dayton's neighborhoods, taping flyers to light poles and slipping them into mailboxes. An older man with a cane squinted at one and said, "You Turner?" "I am," Jimmy replied. "Good hands matter," the man said, nodding. "My son hired some kid who couldn't tell a fuse from a fishhook. I'll call you." Jimmy grinned all the way down the block, but nothing moves without resistance. It came the following Friday at a colonial home in South Park. Ivy crawling up its brick pillars. The job was simple, a faulty circuit in the master bath. Jimmy rang the bell, toolkit in hand. A woman answered, mid-40s, in a sharp blazer, her hair pulled tight. "You're from Turner Works," she said, her eyes narrowing as they flicked over his clean navy polo. Double quotes, "Yes, ma'am, Jimmy Turner." She crossed her arms. "You're the one on that blog with Alina Harper." Jimmy didn't answer, his face neutral. She tilted her head. "She's a friend of my husband's firm." "You really think this little stunt of yours will last?" His voice stayed steady. "I think honest work lasts longer than gossip." She let him in but made a call within earshot. "Yes, he's here," she said, her voice sharp. "I told you she's playing some game." Jimmy didn't flinch. He traced the circuit, replaced a corroded wire, tested the voltage, wrote the invoice, and left without a word. Back in his truck, he rolled the windows down, letting the spring breeze cool his face. His phone buzzed. "Alina, lunch at the shop." He exhaled, the tension easing. "On my way. Bring your paint hands." The shop was a converted brick storefront on a quiet street in downtown Dayton. Alina had rented it for her design work, but it was becoming something more, a shared space for their ideas. Her smaller paintings hung on the back wall, vibrant and raw. The front counter had 2 stools and a chalkboard sign that still read, "Closed," in cursive. Jimmy told her about the client, the phone call, the way the woman's words had echoed the diner. Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't erupt. Instead, she walked to a canvas and flipped it over, revealing a black swirl of tangled lines stitched with gold thread. "I painted this 2 years ago," she said, "right after my ex told me I wasn't relatable enough for his clients. I almost burned it, but I realized broken doesn't mean disposable." She turned to him. "You're not a phase, Jimmy. You're not a scandal. And you're not my savior," he said, stepping closer. "Or my shield. I don't want to be," she said. "I want to be your partner." He smiled, pulled her close, their foreheads touching. "Then let's keep building." The rain came hard that spring, lashing Dayton for 5 straight days. Streets flooded, power lines flickered, and Jimmy Turner's phone buzzed nonstop with emergency calls. Seniors with dark houses, single moms with fridges gone silent, apartment managers pleading for panel resets. He worked until his back ached and his boots squelched, the damp seeping into his bones. Each job was a lifeline, a way to outrun the words still echoing from the diner, the blog, the canceled clients, her project, social climber. He didn't read the comments, didn't check the posts, but they hung over him like a storm cloud. On the 6th day, the storm hit closer. His apprentice, Darius, a lanky 19-year-old from West Dayton, sent a text at 7 a.m. "Boss, you see, the article." Jimmy, elbow deep in a soggy breaker box, frowned. What article? 3 more texts came in quick succession, all with the same headline: Community Hero or Social Climber. The Rise of Turner Works Under the Wing of Alina Harper. The piece, published by a local conservative blog, was a knife dressed as journalism. It twisted Elena's open letter into a stunt, painted Jimmy as a hustler chasing wealth, and included a grainy photo of him helping an elderly client, captioned, "Marketing or Manipulation." Jimmy's stomach churned. He didn't finish reading, just shut off his phone and drove to the shop. The brick storefront on Wyoming Street was quiet, the chalkboard sign still reading closed. Alina was in the back, paint smudged on her cheek, wearing his old Turner Electric hoodie. She looked up, saw his face, and didn't ask what was wrong. "It's out, isn't it?" she said, setting her brush down. He nodded, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You didn't write it," he said, his voice rough. "But I made it possible by putting us in the light." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "They didn't come for us, they came for you." Turned everything we're building into a punchline. "No," she said, standing straighter. "They tried, but we're still standing. There, dragging my name through it," he said, his voice breaking. "I can survive that, but can we survive this?" Silence fell, heavy as the rain outside. Then, softly, "Do you want to stop?" Her question wasn't a threat or a plea, just raw permission. Jimmy sat on the workbench, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I used to think I could outwork judgment. Be good enough, useful enough, and they'd let me in the room. But I was wrong. They don't care what I fix. They only care what I represent." Alina sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. "And what do you represent?" He looked at her, his eyes tired but clear. "Disruption." A soft laugh escaped her. "Then you're not the only one." They sat like that, shoulder to shoulder, the storm tapping the windows until Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then handed it to him. An email from a producer at WYSO, Dayton's NPR affiliate. "We'd love to interview you both." Jimmy stared at the screen. "You think this helps?" Alina smiled, small but certain. "I think it's a chance to tell our story." The interview aired a week later, a 15-minute segment on resilience and partnership. Jimmy sat in the studio, hands folded, his clean navy polo slightly stiff from disuse. Alina sat beside him, her hair pinned up, a simple green sweater over jeans. The host, a woman with a warm voice, asked about Turner Works, about the blog post, about what it meant to build across divides. Jimmy spoke plainly. "I'm not here to be anyone's headline. I just want to build things that don't fall apart in storms. And I found someone who holds the same blueprint." When the host turned to Alina, asking what it meant to build with someone from a different world, she leaned into the mic. "We build with what we have." He brought his hands. I brought the room. The backlash didn't vanish. The blog tried a second piece, but it flopped, shared only by a handful of trolls. The support, though, came stronger church groups, leaving voicemails, local business owners, booking jobs, an elderly client who mailed a handwritten note saying her grandson heard the interview and cried for the first time in a year. The narrative had shifted, not because the noise stopped, but because Jimmy and Elena had spoken louder. One night, Jimmy stood on Elena's porch, the same spot where she'd offered him a milkshake months ago. The air was crisp, autumn creeping into the edges of September. "You scared?" she asked, leaning against the railing. He looked out at the quiet street, the glow from their shop a faint beacon down the block. "Yeah," he admitted, then added, "but not of them anymore." "Then what?" She stepped closer, her eyes steady. "Of how much I care about this, about you, about all of it." "That's not fear, Jimmy," she said, her hand resting on his chest. "That's weight, the kind worth carrying." Autumn settled over Dayton like a soft exhale. Golden leaves gathered at curbs, and the air thinned, carrying the clean bite of coming winter. Turner Works grew, not in leaps but in roots, slow, deep, lasting. Calls came steadily, not from billboards or ads, but from trust. Jimmy still took every job himself, showing up with a clean shirt and a steady gaze, greeting clients with yes, ma'am, or no, sir, even when they were younger than him. But now, people didn't look at him like a stranger. They looked at him like the guy who stayed. One Thursday afternoon, Jimmy stood outside a modest 2-story house on Belmont Avenue. It wasn't grand, no columns, no wraparound porch, just white siding, a red door, and a driveway that needed repaving, but it was theirs. He and Alina had bought it together, a step neither had planned but both had wanted. He unlocked the door, stepping into a foyer that smelled of fresh primer and possibility. Sunlight poured through the bay windows, landing on the hardwood like a promise. 2 mugs sat on the kitchen counter, his, chipped from years of use. Hers, painted with a swirl of blue. A stack of paint swatches lay beside them, labeled dining room palette. Alina was in the back room, barefoot, crouched before a blank wall, a pencil between her fingers. A faint line traced across the drywall, the start of something new. "What are you doing?" Jimmy asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Planning a mural," she said, turning to him, her eyes bright. "Not sure what yet, but I think it starts with hands." He smiled, crossing to her and kissing her temple. "This still feels wild," he whispered. "You, me, here, together, still standing." "It's not wild," she said, her voice serious, "but warm. It's earned." They stood there, the quiet hum of a house beginning its first chapter wrapping around them. No storm, no spotlight, just them. 2 weeks later, they held a dedication. Not for the house, but for the shop. The Wyoming Street storefront had become the Turner and Harper studio, a shared space for Jimmy's electrical work and Elena's design projects. One side held tools, wiring diagrams, and a workbench. The other, canvases, brushes, and a long table for community workshops. The front door bore a wooden sign, Turner and Harper Studio, carved by a local craftsman who'd bartered for a panel repair. The dedication drew a crowd: old clients, new friends, neighbors, Darius and his grandmother, who brought a lemon pound cake wrapped in wax paper. Kids spun in the leaves outside, their laughter mixing with the hum of conversation. Alina took the mic, her hair loose, a paint smudge on her wrist. She didn't read from notes, just spoke. "There's a difference between being given something and being trusted to build it. This space didn't fall into our laps. We laid every plank, screwed every hinge, painted every corner, and we built it knowing the world would ask us to choose between love and peace, truth and safety. We chose each other. And we'll keep choosing." She stepped down, and Jimmy took her place. He looked out at the crowd, older folks wiping their eyes, Darius grinning, Alina watching him like he held a future worth defending. "I used to think the only thing I'd ever own was a toolbox," he said, his voice steady. "Turns out, I get to own something heavier." He paused, his throat tight. Hope. The room went still, then erupted in applause, not loud, but real. That night, back at their house, they stood on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the wind pull gold from the trees. "I still can't believe it," Jimmy whispered. "Then let me remind you," Alina said, leaning into him. "We didn't just survive. We built." The following Monday, a call came that Jimmy didn't expect. The sun was barely up when his phone lit with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Turner?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Angela Morton, estate manager for the Whitaker family. We need an urgent repair at their property in Oakwood. Can you consult today?" Jimmy sat up straighter. The Whitakers were old money, their name etched into Dayton's history libraries, parks, plaques. "I can be there by 11, he said. "Thank you. The address is on your screen." The Whitaker estate was everything its reputation promised: columns, manicured lawns, a garage bigger than his childhood home. Angela Morton, a woman in her 60s with a gray suit and pearls, met him at the door. "The issue's in the conservatory," she said briskly. "The chandelier shorts out. In rain 3 techs couldn't fix it." "I'll do my best, ma'am," Jimmy said, following her inside, toolkit in hand. The chandelier was antique, its wiring a tangle of French craftsmanship and bad patches. He worked quietly, testing lines, tracing faults. He didn't notice the man in the doorway until he spoke. "Well, this is unexpected." Jimmy turned. Stephen Grayson, Elena's ex, stood there tall, polished, a partner at a downtown law firm and a board member of the Dayton Historical Society. His arms were crossed, his smile cold. "Didn't know you moonlighted as an electrician," Grayson said. "I own the business," Jimmy replied, his tone even. Grayson stepped into the room. Alina always had a taste for unconventional projects. Jimmy didn't blink, clipping a frayed wire. "I'm not her project, no." Grayson's voice was smooth, sharp. "Then what are you?" "Her rebellion. A message to her family. You're temporary, Turner. You know that." Jimmy's jaw clenched, but his hands stayed steady. He replaced a corroded connector, tested the voltage, and spoke without looking up. "I build things that last. Including myself." Grayson chuckled. a sound like breaking glass, and walked out. Jimmy finished the job in silence, the chandelier glowing steady when he flipped the switch. Angela Morton waited downstairs with, "I checked you're efficient," she said, smiling. "Better than the last team. We'll call again." "Thank you, ma'am," Jimmy said, stepping into the afternoon lights. Grayson's words didn't burn like they might have months ago. They sparked something else resolve that night. Jimmy found Alina in the shop, staring at a new canvas. Stark black strokes on a red wash, like anger given form. "You okay?" she asked, turning to him. He nodded slowly. Grayson was at the Whitaker job. Her eyes narrowed. "What did he say?" "Enough. You want me to handle it?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "But I need to ask you something." She waited, her paintbrush still in hand. "If it came down to your world or mine, what would you choose?" Alina set the brush down, walked to the workbench, and sat, her eyes steady. "I don't believe I should have to choose, but if they draw a line, I'll burn it to the ground." He smiled, faint but real. "They already drew it. Then, let's build on the ashes." 2 days later, Alina sent an open letter to the Dayton Daily News, titled, "When We Love Outside the Lines." It was sharp, deliberate, and unflinching. "Some see what I've built with Jimmy Turner as rebellion, but rebellion implies destruction. We're constructing equity, presence, partnership. If that makes people uncomfortable, they should ask why." By noon, it had been shared over 2,000 times. Jimmy's inbox filled with support: new clients, old neighbors, a teacher who'd once told him he'd never amount to much, now asking for a quote. One message stood out, from Angela Morton. "The Whitakers would like to cancel future services with Turner Works." No explanation. Jimmy replied, "Noted, thank you." Then he turned to Alina, who was brushing color onto a new canvas. "We lost a client," he said. She looked up, unbothered. "We'll gain 10 more. That night, they stood on the shop's rooftop, overlooking Dayton's skyline, the city they were reshaping with every choice. Jimmy took her hand. Grayson said, "I'm temporary." Alina leaned into him. "Then let's outlast him." Spring gave way to summer, then autumn again. Turner and Harper Studio became a hub not just for repairs or design, but for community. They hosted monthly fix-it days, offering free basic repairs for seniors, single parents, veterans. Kids came on Saturdays to paint with Alina, or learn wiring from Jimmy and Darius. The whispers didn't stop, but they faded, drowned out by the hum of drills, the laughter of children, the clink of coffee mugs. One evening, as leaves fell like gold coins, Jimmy and Alina stood in their Belmont Avenue home. The mural on the back wall was taking shape: 2 hands, one calloused, one paint-stained, reaching across a field of color. "It's us," Alina said, stepping back to admire it. "It's more than that," Jimmy said, his arm around her. "It's what we're building." She turned to him, her eyes bright. "And we're just getting started." They hadn't just rewritten their story. They'd reclaimed it, plank by plank, stroke by stroke, in a city that once tried to draw lines between them. Under the autumn sky, 2 people stood together, unshaken, unbought, unbroken.